In 1863, Jonathan O. Pierce brought on an architect to construct what would become the most magnificent residence St. Louis had witnessed up to that point. Yet by 1868, maintaining a home there proved beyond his means. His riches stemmed from supplying hardtack to the Union forces. These basic biscuits made from just flour, water, and salt sustained troops throughout the Civil War. Such deals brought in vast sums with little exertion. Pierce invested $115,000 in a Gothic-style fortress boasting 18 rooms, a pair of towers, and intricate embellishments that often left guests wandering lost within its halls. Folks dubbed it the Cracker Castle. Many figured it symbolized enduring success. They were mistaken. While most attribute the end of Pierce's prominence to the 1896 tornado, that massive storm ravaged St. Louis, claiming hundreds of lives and wrecking thousands of structures, including the Cracker Castle. However, Pierce had long since faded from the picture. He parted with the property in 1868 and filed for bankruptcy in 1875. When the twister hit 2 decades later, his wealth had evaporated years before. This tale isn't centered on acts of nature. Rather, it explores wartime gains squandered more swiftly than they were gained, and lavish edifices erected on shaky grounds. As the Civil War broke out in April 1861, bakers in St. Louis vied aggressively for federal deals that promised immense fortunes to a select few. The city held a key role as America's third biggest wheat hub, trailing only Chicago and New York. Grain shipments floated in via riverboats from fields in Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. Local mills along the Mississippi turned millions of bushels yearly into flour that fed not just the area but much of the country. The Union troops' top priority was hardtack, the no-frills biscuit designed to endure for months without going bad. In the absence of other provisions, each soldier downed about 10 ounces per day. Feeding an army of 100,000 demanded roughly 31 tons of hardtack daily. The volumes were immense. The formula demanded no expertise. Combine flour, water, and salt. Flatten the dough to a ½ inch thick. Slice into about 3-inch squares. Prick holes in every piece to let steam vent while baking. Fire it in ovens until rock-hard and moisture-free, since any leftover dampness invited mold in storage. Production leaned industrial, not artistic. GIs quipped that the stuff could deflect bullets. They nicknamed it sheet iron, tooth wreckers, or worm castles if it sat too long in humid spots. Some griped that the crackers were 9 months stale upon delivery. Others swore they harked back to the War of 1812. The humor captured their fabled toughness alongside the troops' irritation with bland, repetitive meals. Still, hardtack staved off famine. A fighter could tote enough for days in his kit without fretting over spoilage or bulk. Short on supplies, he'd soften them in coffee, break them into stew, or chomp them straight. Teeth be damned. The biscuits delivered energy sans taste, nutrition minus joy. For bakers, though, hardtack meant earnings on a level no ordinary economy could match. Expenses and rivals barely mattered. The Union scooped up every batch that showed up. The Confederates mirrored that approach. Armies on both sides snapped up whatever reached the supply points. Standards for quality stayed basic. Just ensure they were tough, desiccated, and consumable. Little else drew scrutiny from officials. The packs assured prompt payouts in what felt like boundless amounts. Any baker with flour stocks and baking gear could ramp up output fast by installing extra ovens and bringing on staff. Constraints boiled down to space and flour availability, not buyers. St. Louis hosted several outfits primed to seize the opportunity. Joseph Garneau oversaw the cutting-edge steam-powered cracker plant at 17th and Morgan Streets. Reports from the era hailed it as the globe's biggest cracker facility. At full throttle, It ran non-stop, with crews kneading massive dough portions, machine rolling it out, stamping uniform squares and loading trays into ovens that baked without pause. Dozier, Whale, and Company stood out as another powerhouse. They churned out 1,500 barrels of crackers each day, equaling countless units. By 1878, over 10 years post-war, their yearly revenue hit $500,000, proving that thriving ventures could pivot to everyday commerce. These veteran companies had honed their craft through time, building trust, oversight of standards, and savvy bookkeeping. They knew war deals meant a windfall that wouldn't last forever. Jonathan O. Pierce joined forces with others, starting with the Kendall and Pierce Company and evolving into Pierce, Dimmock and Company. Details on the partnerships are murky, based on what's left of the documents. Records show that Pierce's business flourished in the war period thanks to hardtack contracts. Shipments came in steadily. The bakery ovens operated non-stop. Funds piled up more quickly than Pierce knew how to handle. Nothing suggests he had exceptional entrepreneurial talent. His prosperity stemmed from circumstance, not expertise. He happened to be in the ideal location, offering the perfect item just as the authorities urgently required it. Any local baker capable of mass-producing hardtack attracted plenty of buyers. Fellow bakers in St. Louis grasped this truth. They saw the conflict as a fleeting market anomaly, destined to conclude, so they strategized wisely, viewing wartime earnings as short-term gains to invest thoughtfully. Joseph Garneau kept his enterprise afloat by nurturing ties with non-military clients all through the conflict. Dozier, Whale, and Company adopted comparable approaches, expanding their offerings and developing sales channels suited for post-war recovery. Pierce took a divergent path. Even as hostilities continued and federal deals poured in cash, he chose a course that would eventually ruin him. He resolved to erect a residence grander than any in St. Louis. Affluent families had shifted to Chouteau Avenue, a broad 80-foot-wide artery winding through elite housing districts. Initially envisioned as a trade route channeling westward flow from the river toward Kings Highway, its growth veered otherwise, filling with impressive dwellings instead. John C. Fremont, the famed explorer and political contender, possessed a true mansion there, as observers noted. Karl Schurz, the German arrival turned influential press figure, resided close by. Benjamin Stickney, enriched by his stake in the Planters House Hotel, also constructed his home in the vicinity. These individuals held solid legacies forged over decades of effort. Their riches derived from enduring enterprises. Pierce yearned to join their ranks, yet he lacked the groundwork they had laid. All he had seized were conflict-driven gains. In 1863, midway through the ongoing strife, Pierce engaged architect Charles B. Clark. Clark had trained in New York prior to settling in St. Louis in 1859. Reports from the era painted him as divisive and attention-grabbing. Throughout his professional life, he crafted 33 structures in St. Louis, encompassing places of worship, educational facilities, courthouses, and personal homes. Not a single one endures now. For Pierce, he devised what subsequent descriptions termed an oversized Italianate villa. Twin spires ascended unevenly. Elaborate brick detailing enveloped the facade. Mansard roofs crowned the spires. The edifice soared to 5 levels at its peak, noticeable from afar. Work commenced in 1863, with military packs still assuring revenue. The endeavor spanned 5 years to finish. For a good part of that span, Pierce's hardtack earnings held firm. Cash kept arriving reliably, and he funneled large sums into his grand endeavor. Pierce overlooked basic calculations. The war would conclude. Once it did, hardtack deals would evaporate overnight. The Union forces would disband. Troops would head back to civilian life. Need for army supplies would plummet to zero. Competing bakers anticipated this shift. They broadened their scope. They sustained everyday patrons. They readied for tranquility. Pierce opted for a fortress. He based his prospects on sands that would give way as soon as calm returned. The dwelling that emerged on Chouteau Avenue from 1863 to 1868 swiftly earned the moniker Cracker Castle. The label held sarcasm, underscoring that Pierce's riches arose from the most basic wartime staple under unique conditions. Crackers served as rations for troops and mere sustenance. They hardly formed the bedrock for enduring wealth. Clark's blueprint yielded a building resistant to simple classification. Its core echoed Italian villa forms, yet he inflated the scale and blended in touches from French Second Empire and Gothic Revival styles. The outcome struck as either innovative daring or sheer disarray. The pair of towers anchored the design. They climbed unevenly from diagonal angles, purposefully clashing. One stretched slimmer and higher to 5 floors. The counterpart bulked wider and heavier, ascending 4 floors with added heft, neither aligned in ornamentation or rooftop profile. Such imbalance was deliberate, spurning traditional harmony. The mansard roofs atop both towers infused French Second Empire flair. With their dual-pitched form, these had gained popularity amid Napoleon III's overhaul of Paris. Architects in the United States embraced this design with great zeal amid the Civil War period. For the Cracker Castle, those mansard roofs boasted intricate embellishments using patterned shingles. The masonry showcased intricate designs that demanded expert bricklayers. Motifs shifted along the exterior walls. Ornamental bands divided the levels. At the eaves, corbelling formed with bricks jutting out in tiered formations. Corner quoins provided added depth and heft to the appearance. Such lavish workmanship came at a high price, intended to draw the eye. Substantial ornate brackets upheld the overhanging roof edges, crafted from wood and adorned with swirling motifs and leafy designs. They paired with lavish framing around each window and entrance. These elements lent the residence an air of over-the-top ornamentation. Window sizes and forms differed sharply. Certain ones stretched tall and slim, while others spanned broadly beneath curved arches. On the towers, a few panes were circular or elliptical. This assortment sparked visual appeal, yet also a sense of unease. The gaze darted about without finding rest. From the upper level, an elaborately adorned balcony thrust forward. Beneath it, a veranda spanned the entrance side, held up by pillars. Its wooden arches, etched with Gothic detailing, added further flair. Within, the structure housed 18 chambers. Reports from the time described visitors often wandering astray in its maze-like passages. The arrangement favored spectacle above utility, with spaces linking in surprising sequences. It seemed Clark and Pierce cared more for outward show than everyday usability. The entire endeavor tallied $115,000. Finished in 1868, it equaled about 230 years' earnings for a typical skilled laborer in 1860s America, where yearly pay hovered around $500. Farms of decent size went for $2,000 to $5,000, so Pierce's outlay matched 23 to 58 such properties. Adjusted to today's dollars, the figure nears $2.5 million or beyond. Yet as Pierce erected his grand edifice, fellow St. Louis bakers pursued another path. Joseph Garneau's fresh, steam-powered cracker facility embodied a contrasting approach. He poured funds into machinery enabling swift, large-scale output. Throughout the conflict, he kept ties to everyday shop owners, getting his wares into regional markets. Once Army deals wrapped up in 1865, Garneau swiftly shifted to peacetime output. His plant thrived profitably for years afterward. Garneau knew wartime gains were fleeting boons needing careful handling. He enjoyed a solid life without flashiness. Profits went back into tools and stock, Dwyer, Wiley and Company adhered to the same strategy. Their 1878 sales topped $500,000, well over 10 years post-war, proving steady methods paid off. During hostilities, they branched out beyond hardtack to include civilian crackers and pastries. They handled money with caution. These bakers recognized a truth that escaped Pierce. Lasting enterprise demands more than seizing short-term chances. It calls for creating frameworks that adapt to shifting landscapes. It demands foresight for unavoidable shifts. It requires restraint, channeling spending toward growth instead of indulgence. Pierce aimed for spectacle. As Garneau and Dwyer upgraded kilns and gear, Pierce funded sculpted supports and fancy metalwork. While they nurtured client bonds, he raised spires. While they geared up for post-war life, he chased elite status. The build's schedule exposed how deeply Pierce erred. He started in 1863, with battles ongoing. Completion dragged to 1868, 3 years past Appomattox. Over that half-decade, his fortunes crumbled dramatically. The deals enriching him halted in 1865. Hardtack needs vanished as troops disbanded. Fighters returned to civilian life. Army warehouses quit buying. Federal funds dried up. Midway through the build, Pierce could no longer foot the bills. It had already swallowed huge chunks of his conflict earnings. Still, he seemed to view the home as a stake in societal rank. Through bold design, he sought entry into St. Louis's upper circles. Robert E. Lee's Confederate surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, not only closed the Civil War, but demolished the inflated market propping up Pierce's wealth. The moment struck hard. The structure stood maybe 2/3 done. He'd already sunk perhaps $75,000 or higher. Halting meant wasting it all. Pressing on needed funds he could no longer produce. By 1868, the Cracker Castle stood finished. That very year, Pierce had to let it go. Clark delivered precisely the vision Pierce had envisioned. A residence in St. Louis, like no other, a bold declaration of opulence without limits. Yet what the architect couldn't provide was the steady revenue stream needed to uphold such an extravagant landmark. Pierce had erected a veritable palace, but he hadn't developed the enterprise to sustain it. By the start of 1867, just 2 years following the war's conclusion, Pierce's financial woes had escalated to a critical point. He secured a $25,000 mortgage on the Cracker Castle, which amounted to about 1/5 of the total cost he'd poured into its creation. This loan aimed to inject funds for the mounting obligations that were spiraling out of control. With no reliable earnings to uphold his way of life or the property's upkeep, Pierce was pledging his primary holding as collateral. The mortgage granted a brief reprieve, but it failed to address the core issues. Pierce still lacked a viable operation producing consistent income. The borrowed sum would likely deplete within a year or so, judging by his expenditure habits. Without fresh revenue streams, he'd soon confront the identical predicament, now compounded by loan repayments and rising interest. Rather than fostering growth through smart ventures, Pierce was depleting his leftover resources. He tried marketing the property, aiming to recover at least his outlay. However, locating a purchaser ready to pay close to $115,000 was futile. The dwelling's exorbitant price tag deterred most prospects, as did its eccentricity, impracticality for daily family use, and overt extravagance. While the 18 chambers and lavish furnishings catered to ego, they ignored everyday functionality. Upkeep expenses further repelled cautious buyers. As offers remained scarce over the months, Pierce gradually tempered his price hopes. Selling at any figure had become essential, since holding onto it was no longer feasible. Each month piled on fresh costs for fuel, levies, repairs, and basic servants. The edifice was steadily devouring his final reserves. Toward the end of 1867, a prospective buyer emerged. Fidelio C. Sharp, an attorney and partner at the firm of Sharp and Broadhead, consented to acquire the Cracker Castle for $50,000. Pierce had invested $115,000 in its construction under 5 years prior, yet now he was parting with it for less than half that sum. The setback was devastating. He'd transformed wartime gains into a showpiece that shed $65,000 in worth almost instantly. The residents had absorbed funds without yielding any benefits. Far from an investment, this represented the squandering of riches via lavish display. Sharp could afford to hold on to what Pierce could no longer sustain, thanks to his reliable earnings. As a legal practitioner in a reputable practice, Sharp drew ongoing client fees annually. His livelihood wasn't tied to fleeting wartime demands, giving him the stability to cover the home's perpetual demands. Sharp retained ownership of the Cracker Castle for the subsequent 10 years. Pierce, by contrast, would never reside there. The transaction closed in 1868, coinciding with the project's completion. Pierce had possessed the finished structure for virtually no time at all. Construction had commenced in 1863, amid his military supply payments. He pressed on, past the war's close, evidently assuming his profits would endure. By the moment final touches were applied, the house belonged to someone else. The $50,000 proceeds offered short-term cash flow, yet they didn't resolve Pierce's fundamental challenges. He remained without an enterprise yielding regular returns. Pierce, Dimmick and Company had struggled to adapt to post-war realities. Absent assured federal deals, the firm couldn't muster enough earnings. That same 1868, when he offloaded the Cracker Castle, Pierce divested his stake in Pierce, Dimmick and Company to Johannes Dunham. He was methodically cashing in his holdings, transforming them into liquid assets, as he geared up to depart St. Louis for good. The metropolis where he'd strived to join the upper echelons had instead witnessed his stark downfall. Pierce relocated to Boston. Records don't clarify why he selected Boston. It might have involved kin who could assist, or a desire to reboot away from his notoriety, or prospects he deemed unavailable in St. Louis anymore. Regardless of his motives, the relocation didn't revive his prosperity. On June 8, 1875, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch announced Jonathan O. Pierce's bankruptcy declaration. His liabilities totaled $50,000, precisely the figure from the Cracker Castle sale 7 years before. The numbers encapsulated Pierce's ruin entirely. He'd amassed a solid wealth selling hardtack amid the conflict. He'd funneled $115,000 into a mansion. Compelled to sell for $50,000, he faced insolvency 7 years on, with obligations matching that payout. All the earnings from the war had vanished entirely. Not a single cent was left. Now think about the achievements of the other bakers over that same time frame. Joseph Garneau's modern steam-powered cracker factory kept generating profits consistently for years on end. His company viewed wartime gains as one-time boosts meant for smart investments. Garneau seamlessly transitioned his output to everyday consumers once the Army deals dried up. Dozier, Wiley and Company made a similar smooth shift. They stuck to core operational standards, even amid the wartime surge. They fostered lasting ties with buyers that went beyond any temporary agreement. By 1878, their yearly revenue of $500,000 proved the value of enduring strategies. Jonathan O. Pierce, on the other hand, ignored all these steps. He acted as if short-term gains were endless riches. He burned through cash quicker than it came in. He erected a lavish showpiece instead of strengthening his enterprise. The rapid downfall exposed just how empty his prosperity truly was. Entering the 1860s as a mere obscure baker, he rose to affluence amid the conflict. He constructed the priciest residence in St. Louis. Yet by 1875, just 10 years post-war, insolvency struck. The full journey from anonymity to fortune and then devastation spanned scarcely 15 years. Jonathan O. Pierce botched the fundamental challenge of safeguarding riches. He never questioned if his earnings could endure. He failed to prepare for the certain close of military deals. He lacked the restraint needed to turn fleeting gains into lasting holdings. He chose a grand edifice over a viable operation. That edifice endured beyond his failure in bankruptcy and loomed for many more decades. In 1878, 3 years after Jonathan O. Pierce's filing, the Cracker Castle switched hands once more. Fidelio C. Sharp transferred it to Congressman Charles E. Pierce, an unmarried lawyer who resided there for 18 years. Charles E. Pierce possessed the reliable earnings from his legal work and government position to cover the property's upkeep. For him, the dwelling accounted for maybe 10 or 15% of his career income. Charles E. Pierce managed what Jonathan O. Pierce could not. To Charles E. Pierce, the Cracker Castle was merely a suitable dwelling. It suited him well, as a home worthy of a thriving lawyer and lawmaker. Jonathan O. Pierce had orchestrated his own demise, yet the castle remained upright. The numbers behind Jonathan O. Pierce's ruin were merciless, laying bare with stark precision how fast considerable assets can evaporate due to misguided actions. Substantial wealth, when fractured by bad judgments, yields liabilities. Those liabilities, eroded by time, yield nothing. In the 10 years following the war's conclusion, Jonathan O. Pierce plummeted from notable prosperity to utter fiscal collapse. The sequence became evident under impartial scrutiny. Despite ample time, Jonathan O. Pierce erected no enduring enterprise. Military PACs delivered effortless cash with little expertise needed. The authorities snapped up all output at fixed rates. Jonathan O. Pierce never mastered vying in standard commerce, controlling expenses tightly, or adapting to shifts. When the fabricated war-driven economy halted suddenly in 1865, Jonathan O. Pierce possessed no means to produce revenue via routine trade. The $115,000 poured into the house amounted to squandered capital, not productive outlay. In contrast to shares, securities, useful machinery, or growth initiatives, the house yielded zero returns. It steadily drained funds via taxes, repairs, fuel for warmth, and servant pay. Each year, Jonathan O. Pierce held it. The property demanded hefty sums just to operate. In return, it offered solely lodging and status, neither aiding in restoring his emptied coffers. The $25,000 mortgage from 1867 was funds borrowed without a viable path to reimbursement from ongoing or expected revenue. That borrowing merely delayed the total depletion by a year or so. The interest further swelled his regular outlays without addressing the core issue of insufficient earnings. The $50,000 from the 1868 sale cemented a devastating deficit, extinguishing any slim chance of rebound. Jonathan O. Pierce had transformed $115,000 of wartime bounty into $50,000 liquid through the folly of raising an unpractical mansion that no one coveted at its billed price. The $65,000 gap had dissolved into ornate trim and ornamental masonry. That sum equated to over 130 years' pay for a typical laborer. The $50,000 in obligations noted in his 1875 bankruptcy declaration sealed the downfall and unveiled the depth of his fiscal blunders. Jonathan O. Pierce hadn't just frittered away his conflict earnings imprudently. He had amassed borrowings matching the full sum from unloading his prime holding. At bankruptcy, he was indebted to the tune of what he gained from the Cracker Castle 7 years prior. The whole progression from affluence to insolvency unfolded in a mere 10 years. Contrast this downward path with the fates of other major American fortunes amassed in the same historical context. John D. Rockefeller, launched Standard Oil in 1870, just 5 years following the Civil War's conclusion. Even as Pierce grappled with mounting difficulties, Rockefeller maintained a straightforward lifestyle amid building what evolved into the nation's largest fortune. Crucially, he implemented family trusts and organizational frameworks specifically aimed at safeguarding wealth for future generations. Today, over 150 years since John D. Rockefeller started Standard Oil, the Rockefellers continue to hold substantial riches, with the family's combined assets estimated at more than $10 billion, distributed among about 200 heirs. They formed foundations, set up dedicated investment firms, and constructed enduring institutions that survived beyond any single family member's lifespan. They recognized that sustaining wealth demands deliberate oversight and thoughtful planning. Similarly, Andrew Carnegie amassed his steel empire during that time, offloading Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million. In the ensuing 2 decades, Carnegie channeled his efforts into organized giving. He erected libraries throughout the United States and the United Kingdom, supported higher education institutions, and created funding mechanisms and trusts that still function actively. Carnegie realized that amassed riches needed a mission extending past mere self-indulgence. By no means were Rockefeller or Carnegie ethically superior to Pierce. Each built their empires via aggressive tactics that demolished rivals and systematically underpaid laborers. Yet they comprehended an essential truth about wealth that eluded Pierce entirely. Fortunes must either yield profits via effective investments or fulfill objectives greater than ostentatious living. Pierce's riches achieved none of these. They merely eroded away through expenditures fueled solely by ego and a drive for social status. He yearned intensely to etch his name among St. Louis's upper crust. Rather, he ended up as a stark warning of profiteering amid war, capped by a dramatic fiscal downfall. The press coverage of his 1875 bankruptcy offered no compassion or esteem. He had ascended via fleeting opportunities that called for little expertise. He had squandered vast sums on a flashy mansion while erecting nothing lasting. He forfeited it all due to flawed choices that anyone with common sense might have foreseen. What Pierce failed to grasp was that preserving wealth calls for skills vastly unlike those for gaining it. Accumulating riches in turbulent times requires specific talents, but sustaining and expanding them under routine circumstances requires wholly distinct proficiencies. Pierce barely managed the initial challenge in the inflated wartime market. He proved utterly inept at the latter once peacetime economics resumed. By 1878, 3 years on from when Pierce's bankruptcy entered public files, the Cracker Castle had switched hands once more. Fidelio Sharp transferred the property to Congressman Charles E. Pierce, a single lawyer who resided there at ease for the subsequent 18 years. This Pierce possessed the steady earnings from his career to cover the residence's hefty upkeep costs without distress. As an accomplished attorney with a consistent clientele, he earned dependable payments. His congressional role added further revenue and bolstered his standing in legal circles. The mansion accounted for maybe 10 to 15% of Charles E. Pierce's career-long professional income, a notable yet controllable slice of his assets. For the original Pierce, it had embodied nearly his full wealth, transformed into one immovable holding. Charles E. Pierce could manage it effortlessly because he had forged his path, delivering essential legal aid that endured, not seizing a short-lived boon from unusual events. To him, the Cracker Castle was merely a dwelling. The building suited him well, as a cozy refuge for a man able to care for it fittingly. He seems to have inhabited it, true to its purpose, hosting visitors within its walls, relishing its rooms free from the monetary worries that tormented the first Pierce. The sequence of owners exposed the utter fragility of Jonathan O. Pierce's affluence. His prosperous phase lasted no more than 5 years from around 1863 when wartime gains hit their high, until 1868 when he parted with the house. In that narrow span, he had funneled all his assets into a property he ultimately couldn't retain. Jonathan O. Pierce had orchestrated his ruin via choices that disregarded simple math and sound commerce basics. Still, the castle endured. Come 1896, the Cracker Castle had cycled through multiple proprietors and remained a prominent home in a district that had transformed far past Jonathan O. Pierce's fleeting era of success. Charles E. Pierce, the unmarried lawyer and lawmaker, had occupied it from his 1878 acquisition via Fidelio Sharp. For nearly 2 decades, the residents had provided Charles E. Pierce with a suitable home that matched his standing as an attorney and politician. He never relied on it to signal his presence or demonstrate his achievements. Those were already secured via his law career and time in Congress. The Cracker Castle merely functioned as his personal dwelling. Over the previous 30 years, since its construction as Pierce's landmark, St. Louis had transformed profoundly. By 1896, the urban population exceeded 500,000, positioning it as America's 4th biggest city. Union Station, launched in 1894, acted as the central rail gateway for a nation on the move across the Midwest. Business expansion had continually spread away from the waterfront. The city exuded wealth, assurance, and cutting-edge progress relative to the period. On May 27, 1896, a Wednesday, the day commenced peacefully, offering no hints of impending disaster. Early hours showed no signs of harsh weather, and locals carried on with routine activities. The weather office anticipated thunderstorms, but nothing worse. Back then, meteorologists had no tools to forecast tornadoes, known to them as cyclones. By midday, attentive observers noticed the clouds growing more threatening. Barometric readings plummeted noticeably. Temperatures plunged sharply. From the west, ominous dark green formations advanced visibly toward town. In the mid-afternoon, the heavens assumed a disconcerting hue that alarmed anyone glancing skyward. Around 4:30 p.m., the air cooled abruptly and intensely. Witnesses recounted that by about 5, dusk fell like deepest night, an eerie and suffocating gloom. Pedestrians halted on streets, gazing up in awe. Suddenly, ferocious gusts unleashed their fury. The funnel descended on the western fringe of Tower Grove Park, carving eastward into the urban core. Spanning roughly a mile across, it ravaged the ground for about 20 minutes straight. Its route sliced through St. Louis's premier districts, such as Lafayette Square and Compton Heights. Positioned at the intersection of Chouteau and St. Anne, the Cracker Castle lay squarely in its trajectory. Later classified as an F4 on the Fujita scale, the vortex packed winds from 168 to 199 miles per hour. Eyewitness tales painted a scene of ruin unprecedented in the city's history. The tempest leveled 311 edifices entirely. It severely wrecked another 7,200 buildings, while 1,300 others endured major impacts. In those brief 20 minutes, 255 lives ended instantly. Over 1,000 individuals faced grave wounds, and more than 5,000 residents were left homeless and stripped of belongings. Lafayette Square, home to the elite, bore especially brutal losses. The twister reduced the green space to a barren expanse of denuded trunks and shattered remnants, as stunned onlookers described it. Century-old oaks were wrenched from the soil and flung blocks distant. The sturdy iron barriers encircling the square twisted into grotesque knots, barely identifiable. The sheer might defied easy grasp. Gale forces embedded a shovel 6 inches into solid timber. It propelled 2x10-inch boards through 5 16-inch wrought iron panels on the Eads Bridge, built, ironically, as cyclone-resistant. When the whirlwind slammed into the Cracker Castle at peak intensity, one of its signature twin towers vanished from the edifice. The spire, erected by Pierce and Charles B. Clark to proclaim stature and enduring for 28 years, was ripped clean off the main body. News from the time highlighted this loss, observing that lightning had also hit it, though experts debated if the bolt or the blasts initiated the collapse. The dwelling endured irreparable havoc. Every window lay in shards. Load-bearing walls buckled. Clark's intricate flourishes, the sculpted corbels, lavish moldings, and patterned masonry, were obliterated or left perilously frail. Ornate timber vaults splintered apart. The wrought iron veranda warped beyond recognition. Those sophisticated masonry and carpentry features, which had weathered Pierce's financial ruin and 3 decades of elements, proved no match for 20 minutes of F4 fury. Charles E. Pierce occupied the Cracker Castle during the onslaught. Records don't confirm his exact whereabouts at the moment, but post-storm assessments confirm the place utterly unlivable. The $115,000 investment now offered no secure refuge. Rescue operations kicked off right away. Volunteers from Light Battery A and the 1st Regiment mobilized quickly. In under an hour, 32 troops joined the search and recovery efforts. Company G's bicycle unit stepped in once the railroads were cut off. Communication lines like telephones and telegraphs lay in ruins. Roads became blocked and unusable. Officials had to be notified via messengers on bikes, the sole reliable means left. The devastation's magnitude sparked doubts about St. Louis's ability to hold the Republican National Convention in June, merely 3 weeks hence. City leaders rallied for extensive debris removal operations. Despite everything, the event went ahead on schedule, underscoring the disaster's intensity alongside the locals' resolve to show their town could rebound. In the ensuing days, more than 140,000 curious visitors poured in to survey the wreckage. They streamed off trains at Union Station and wandered through the ruined zones. Photographers hailing from St. Louis, Chicago, and beyond hurried over to capture the scenes. Local studios churned out slim paperback volumes of images as mementos. Some shots featured the Cracker Castle, depicting its battered form with a vanished tower, shattered panes, and weakened walls. What was once a home crafted to dazzle now symbolized the raw force of the elements. Demolition followed shortly thereafter. Fixing it up wasn't feasible. Developer bought it in January 1940. The plot sat vacant for years on end, until a developer bought it in January 1940. The Cracker Castle had vanished 33 years post-loss for Pierce, and 21 years after his financial collapse. Its tale offers enduring insights into prosperity, still pertinent well over a century, since the twister leveled what Pierce's decisions had long since undermined. Narratives of this episode often zero in on the whirlwind alone. The spectacular act of nature crafts a gripping tale, complete with evident sufferers and sorrow. Visions of toppled spires and wind-ravaged barriers deliver striking imagery that dry bankruptcy records can't evoke. Yet zeroing in just on the storm overlooks the core truth. By May 27, 1896, when the gale hit, Pierce had been insolvent for 21 years. He'd surrendered the property's title 28 years prior, back in 1868. Sure, the tornado leveled the edifice, but Pierce's own paths had eroded his riches ages before the gales howled. The true chronicle isn't the storm's doing. It's rooted in prolonged selections, in calls that spurned simple math and sound commerce basics, in focuses that prized show over depth. Reflect on Pierce's handling of his wartime gains with various paths open to him. He might have placed funds securely in bonds or equities for reliable yields. He could have channeled them into enduring enterprises targeting everyday consumers. He might have branched into allied goods or tucked away big sums while keeping a frugal yet pleasant life. Rather, He poured $115,000 into a dwelling, meant chiefly to awe folks who'd amassed their riches via steady, long-haul labor. Each buck funneled into ornate masonry and sculpted supports was one that might have bought income-generating holdings or buffered against coming hardships. At every juncture, Pierce favored ostentation over endurance. The fallout was utterly foreseeable. Fellow St. Louis bakers charted a different course. Joseph Garneau's fresh steam-powered cracker plant boomed amid the conflict, yet endured by methodically gearing up for peacetime. Garneau poured into machinery versatile for non-military goods. He forged ties with merchants across the area. He stewarded his books with caution, viewing wartime earnings as fleeting boons. His operation churned profits for decades beyond the close of army deals, thanks to his grasp of foundational enterprise tenets. Dwyer, Whale and Company pursued nearly identical tactics, their yearly revenue topping $500,000 over 10 years past the war, showed viable methods paid off. They'd spread risks during hostilities, nurtured client bonds, reined in expenses, and banked hefty profit shares. They saw the conflict as a deviation and readied for routine's comeback. Pierce erected solely the residence. War's close saw his earnings vanish overnight. He pledged his prime holding, offloaded it at ruinous discount, and sought bankruptcy relief inside 10 years. The trajectory mirrored countless historic flops in trade. Juxtaposing against other U.S. dynasties highlights Pierce's errors in stark relief. The Rockefellers erected intricate frameworks to safeguard riches through generations. They set up kin trusts under expert oversight, launched charities with defined goals, and formed investment arms with rigorous plans. Their descendants continue to hold substantial riches even now, well over a century and a half on, boasting a combined net worth surpassing $10 billion spread across about 200 heirs. The Rockefellers recognized that safeguarding riches demands ongoing oversight, solid organizational frameworks, and meticulous strategy. In his later years, Andrew Carnegie focused intensely on organized giving. Following the sale of his steel empire, he financed the construction of public libraries throughout the United States and the United Kingdom, supported higher education institutions that endure to this day, and set up funds and foundations that still fulfill societal needs. Carnegie realized that amassed fortunes demand objectives extending far beyond mere self-indulgence. Pierce was no more ethically elevated than either Rockefeller or Carnegie. All three amassed their riches via aggressive tactics. Yet they comprehended a key aspect of affluence that eluded Pierce entirely. Riches either produce gains via effective investments or fulfill broader goals beyond ostentatious show. Pierce's fortune accomplished neither. It merely eroded away through expenditures that catered solely to ego. The core insight becomes evident when expressed directly. Ephemeral earnings call for enduring strategies. Profits from conflict, lottery jackpots, bequests, or sudden boons offer chances to invest prudently or squander recklessly. Prudent investing yields enduring worth that grows steadily. Lavish outlays bring fleeting pleasure, trailed by irreversible depletion. At every turn, Pierce opted for expenditure. He erected a symbol of fleeting opulence. This edifice proclaimed his prominence, yet failed to uphold it. As such structures need continuous funding for upkeep, the residents incurred annual demands for land taxes, fuel for warmth, repairs, and servant salaries. In essence, Pierce had fashioned a snare, ensuring his fiscal downfall. The math was starkly straightforward. He invested $115,000 in constructing the home. Upon compelled sale, he netted $50,000. The shortfall of $65,000 evaporated into ornamental features yielding nothing in return. This sum equated to over 130 years' earnings for a typical laborer. Assets Pierce could never reclaim. 7 years post-sale, he filed for insolvency with liabilities matching that sale amount. His whole estate dissolved in under 10 years due to decisions flouting basic monetary principles. The Cracker Castle outlasted Pierce's possession by 28 years and his riches by 21. The structure endured as a marker of decisions, not triumphs. It passed through 3 successive proprietors after Pierce relinquished it. Each managed the costs that overwhelmed him, thanks to reliable career earnings instead of short-lived surges. A tornado razed the Cracker Castle in 1896, obliterating the tangible remnant of Pierce's legacy. Yet his monetary collapse had transpired long before. The storm merely erased the final trace of prosperity long since faded. The fundamental reality stands evident. Pierce constructed a grand residence. He neglected to forge an enterprise. The residence steadily devoured his assets. Without the business he failed to create, no fresh revenue emerged. The result was unavoidable once he prioritized spectacle over endurance. What lingers is a teaching relevant to all confronting abrupt affluence in our time. Prosperity isn't an enduring state secured by its first gathering. It demands vigilant stewardship, channeled via suitable legal and monetary mechanisms, and aimed at either profitable yields or significant aims. Absent such rigor, even vast estates can vanish swiftly, surviving only in insolvency filings and images of vanished edifices. Pierce absorbed this wisdom too tardily to apply it. Others might glean it by examining his foreseeable collapse. The twister required 33 years to demolish Pierce's creation. His own decisions needed just 10 years to obliterate his acquisitions. When Anderson Cooper joined Howard Stern in 2014 to explore his lineage's heritage and his stance on bequeathed riches, he had already forged a thriving profession solely on his merits and efforts. As the CNN reporter raised amid the renowned Vanderbilt lineage, Cooper deliberately spurned the implications of inherited bounty and undeserved status. From childhood, his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, instilled that no endowment awaited his maturity. In numerous interviews, Cooper expressed sincere appreciation for this stance. To Stern, he stated forthrightly that passed-down funds act as an ambition killer, a blight eroding drive and direction. Who, among major inheritors, has truly accomplished much independently? The query resolves via myriad cases of bequeathed wealth spawning squandered existences. The cycle that undid Pierce mirrored precisely the one that unraveled the Vanderbilts and myriad other U.S. dynasties over time. Spending fleeting riches, mostly on ostentatious shows instead of smart investments, inevitably leads to downfall. Following his Yale graduation, Cooper finagled access to battlefields using a loaned camera, hawking his videos to whatever outlets would take them. Lacking any media ties or assured jobs, he documented African hunger crises and Bosnian wars, frequently endangering himself to earn his stripes via hands-on effort. CNN eventually spotted his skills and brought him on board. Now his annual income hovers around $20 million from his reporting gigs. His total assets surpass $60 million, all forged independently in the news world, not passed down. In 2021, Cooper published a volume on the Vanderbilts called Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. The very heading laid bare the harsh truth: ascent followed by decline, not sustained growth or evolution, but outright tumble. Total disintegration of the nation's top wealth into near insolvency over just 4 generations. Through the book's chapters, Cooper recounted wandering the vacant chambers of estates his Vanderbilt forebears had erected, lingering in halls meant to proclaim eternal status, now repurposed as exhibits or supplanted by skyscrapers. He detailed spending habits that felt utterly routine to those raised in such opulence, folks who truly thought the bounty would endure indefinitely. It didn't endure. It scarcely endured 100 years. That core mechanism had unfolded in St. Louis years before, on a more modest level yet, with the exact same drivers. Jonathan Pierce began with zilch and amassed a solid estate via low-expertise, wartime deals. He poured it all into constructing a lavish edifice to trumpet his ascent. A decade post-war, he went bust. The edifice outlasted him for years until a twister razed it for good. Though the storm was just completing the demolition, his decisions had initiated long before. Gloria Vanderbilt, Anderson Cooper's mom, grasped this cycle intimately from her own tough early years. Despite receiving funds young and gaining notoriety as the poor little rich girl amid a lurid custody fight, she devoted her grown-up years to crafting her own legacy instead of coasting on family cash. In 1976, she teamed up with apparel maker Mjani to launch a collection of branded jeans featuring her name and mark on the rear pocket. The debut TV spot for Gloria Vanderbilt jeans debuted in 1978. By day's close, the entire stockpile, 150,000 units, had vanished from shelves in mere hours. In under 2 years, the label was pulling in more than $200 million yearly. Gloria achieved what no Vanderbilt after the founding Commodore had pulled off, generating riches via real labor, not just burning through bequests. In a 1985 New York Times interview, she shared a deep insight on self-earned cash versus handed-down wealth. Quote, 1. Echoing the Billie Holiday tune. Quote 2. The difference cut to the core. Earnings hold a distinct value, substance, and significance compared to windfalls. The twist was exquisitely fitting. The multi-great-granddaughter of the tycoon behind America's premier rail network rediscovered prosperity in denim pitched to everyday female workers. The clan that had funneled years into erecting grand chateaus to assert dominance now saw their label sewn onto the seats of average folks' pants. The Vanderbilts had unwittingly turned egalitarian at last. Pierce never had a shot at atonement or fresh starts. He raised his castle amid a short burst of easy funds. He squandered it the instant the stream dried up. Bankruptcy hit 7 years on. After that, he vanished from the annals, recalled only as a warning. Since then, fortune's cycle has spun full circle. The Commodore amassed $200 million, worth hundreds of billions now, and bequeathed it to heirs he assumed would expand it eternally. 4 generations later, his great-grandkids were broke or close to it. The sprawling estates got torn down. The rail lines got offloaded. The surname that ruled Fifth Avenue devolved into a tag on bargain slacks. Yet maybe this end result is precisely what the Commodore might have favored, had he glimpsed ahead. At heart, he was a bootstrap success who raised an empire from scraps. He scorned his sons outright for failing to merit their legacies. He grasped more profoundly than any heir after him that riches lacking direction or the rigor of hard-won effort turned toxic, eroding rather than enduring. Pierce might have grasped this if he'd paused to reflect on his actions. The war had handed him fleeting prosperity amid events demanding little expertise. He might have handled it, just like Joseph Garneau and fellow thriving bakers, as an ephemeral boon, calling for prudent allocation and methodical strategy. He could have cultivated a lasting enterprise catering to everyday consumers. He might have embraced simplicity while safeguarding his economic prospects. Yet he erected the Cracker Castle instead. That pivotal decision in 1863, when he engaged Charles Clark, ignited the entire chain of events. The fork in the road, forging useful ventures versus crafting showpieces, channeling funds for profit versus squandering them on spectacle. Such decisions dictate if short-lived gains solidify into lasting security or dissipate entirely. At every juncture, Pierce erred. The fallout unfolded with inevitable logic. $115,000 poured into building. $50,000 recouped via compulsory auction. $50,000 in liabilities, 7 years on. Insolvency, then forgotten. The empire raised on Biscuits collapsed in under 10 years. The stronghold raised on that empire withstood another 28. before a storm ravaged it. But the tempest merely concluded what Pierce's missteps had begun. It required 33 years for the whirlwind to raise his creation. His blunders needed just 10 to shatter his achievements. God bless the child that's got his own. The cracker castle has vanished, yet the moral persists.